In the last lesson, we introduced ourselves to Google Decoding API, and we talked about the benefits and the functionalities, what it can do for us. Now the next thing we need to do is to go ahead and make use of it within our application. So we already know that for us to make use of Google Decoding API, we kind of have to make a web request within our application. But for us to be able to make a web request within our app, there is a particular package that will enable us to do that. So we first of all need to install the HTTP package. So I'm going to go to the website where we usually download our packages. So I'm going to search for HTTP. So this package will allow us to make post and get requests within our app. So I'm going to go ahead and install it. Alright, so I'm going to return back to our Android Studio. So I'm going to pull up our pubspec.yaml file. So I'm going to go ahead and paste the HTTP dependency, and I'm going to click on pub-get. Alright, so this has been properly installed for us. But before we do this, we really appreciate good code organization. Now the first thing we want to do will be to set up a very good flow for making web requests throughout our application. So to be able to do that, I'm going to create a special class that is going to handle all the get and post requests that we're going to be making within our application. You can easily call this a network service or a helper. So for me, I prefer to call it a request helper because it's helping me do web requests. It's as simple as that. So what I'm going to do will be to create a new folder. So this folder, I'm going to call it helpers. So that's where all the helper files that we're going to be having throughout our application is going to be located. So I'm going to call these helpers. Now I'm going to go ahead and create a new .dat file. So I'm going to call this .dat file request helper. Alright, so the first thing I'm going to do here will be to create a new class. So I'm going to call this class request helper. So the first thing I'm going to do will be to create a method that is actually going to perform all the get requests. So this method, I'm going to name it get request. Now this method also needs to return response from the request for us. So we kind of have to expect something back from this particular method. So because this is a web request, we don't know exactly what to expect, but most of the time we'll be expecting a string, but because we don't know for sure, we're going to use a dynamic. So we expect this method to return a dynamic for us, and this method needs to be asynchronous, so we're going to add features to it. So here I'm going to have feature of the type of dynamic, which is exactly what we want to return at the end of the day. So I'm going to name the method getRequest, and bam. So this method is going to be asynchronous, so I'm going to go ahead and add async to it. So by adding feature, it means that whenever we call this method, we can actually await for the method to return a response to us before we can continue whatever thing that we're doing. Now the next thing I'm going to do will be to add a static signature to this method. The reason for this is because I want to be able to access this particular method from anywhere within our application without having to initialize this class first of all. Now the next thing I need to do will be to pass in the URL of which we're going to be using to make the request. So here I'm going to have string URL. Okay, now we are almost ready to go. The last thing we need to do is to import the HTTP package. So I can simply go back to the documentation, scroll down, and this is how to import it. I can copy this and return back to our Visual Studio and paste this on top of the class. Alright, now we are ready to rock and roll. So how are we going to make the request? So I can simply go ahead and say http.response. So I'm going to call this response. So this is going to be equal to await http.get, and I'm going to go ahead and pass in the URL. So this simple line of code will go ahead and make the request and get some response. Now the next thing we need to do is to go ahead and decode the response. But before we do that, we first of all need to confirm that this request is successful. So I'm going to say if response.status code. So if the status code is equal to 200, it means that the request is successful. Now the next thing I'm going to do will be to retrieve the content or the body of the response, more like what the response contains. So here I'm going to have data. This is going to be equal to response.body. So most of the time our response is going to be mostly JSON string. So we really need to decode the response first of all. So I'm going to call this decoded data. This is going to be equal to JSON decode, and I'm going to pass in the data, right? So I'm going to just retype this, JSON decode. Alright, so this will go ahead and decode the data, and finally I can go ahead and return the decoded data. Bam! So let's say peradventure our request was not successful, maybe there was no internet connectivity or something has happened. I can go ahead and add an else statement, and this time around I can just return failed, right? So this is just a string. So there is a lot of things that can actually go wrong in a web request. So to protect our application from any possible crash resulting from a web request, I'm going to encapsulate all of this code inside a try-catch block. Right, so I'm going to go ahead and copy all of this and paste it here. And whenever an error occurs, I'm going to simply go ahead and return failed. So now we have our request helper ready. Now the next thing I'm going to do will be to create a new .dat file. So this .dat file, I'm going to call it helper methods. So this is all in the bait to ensure that our code is pretty well organized. I'm going to be putting all the methods that is actually going to be helping us to do very important things inside of this class. So I'm going to go ahead and create the file. So I'm going to call this helper methods. Right. So the first thing will be to create a class, and the class is going to be helper methods. Okay, so now that we have that, the next thing we need to do will be to create a method that's actually going to perform the geocoding request. So I can simply call this method find coordinate address. Alright, so at the end of the day, we expect this method to return the formatted address for us. So because of that, this is supposed to be a feature that is going to return a string for us. And we're going to add an async signature to this because it's going to be asynchronous. Alright. Also, if we want this method to be available anywhere within our application, we can just go ahead and add the static signature. So for us to be able to perform this request, we need an instance of a position object, right? So the position object is going to contain the longitude and latitude coordinates of our current position. So I'm going to have position. So let's go ahead and perform the request. Now the first thing we need to do will be to go ahead and confirm that we have an active internet connectivity. So we actually went over this when we coded our login and registration, so we just need to go ahead and implement that here. Alright, so when we don't have an active internet connectivity, we can simply go ahead and return the place address variable, which for now is actually empty, right? Now the next thing we need to do will be to build up our URL. So in the lecture preceding this particular lesson, I've already shared the URL for the Google Geocoding API. So I'm going to go ahead and paste it, and we can go ahead and interpolate the necessary variables. So our URL will be request ready. So what we need to do here is to go ahead and replace the latitude and the longitude coordinates with the latitude and longitude coordinates of our current position, and afterwards we're going to go ahead and add our map key. So let's go ahead and do that. So I'm going to delete this. I'm going to add the $, and here I'm going to have position dot latitude, and here I'm going to have position dot longitude. Now the next thing we need to do will be to add our map key, and our map key was actually saved in our global variables, so we just need to go ahead and access it. Alright, so we have our map key and our URL is ready. So we don't need to add these curly braces. Now the next thing we need to do will be to go ahead and make the request. So I'm going to go ahead and save our response. This will be equal to await, and we're going to go ahead and call the get request in our request helper, and we're going to pass in our URL. So I'm going to have request helper dot get request, and we're going to pass in our URL. Bam. Now the next thing we need to do will be to confirm that our request is successful. So I'm going to go ahead and say if response is not equal to failed. So if this condition is met, it means that our request was successful. Now the next thing we need to do will be to go ahead and retrieve our formatted address. So if we go to our example request, inside of the results, the first result, which is this, if we drop this down, we can see the formatted address. So this is actually what we have in mind. So let's go ahead and retrieve that. So here I'm going to go ahead and say place address will be equal to response, results, the first result, and formatted address. So to ensure I don't make any mistake here, I can go and copy the spellings for the formatted address. I don't want to make any mistake. Alright, now the next thing I'm going to do will be to go ahead and return the place address. So with this, we've successfully implemented the Google Geocoding API. Now the next thing we need to do will be to go ahead and call this method to confirm that everything works appropriately. So I'm going to call this method inside the setup position locator. The reason for this is because as at this time, we now have results for our current position. So what I'm going to do will be to go ahead and print the result, that is our place address at the end of the day. So I'm going to have string address. This is going to be equal to await helper methods dot find coordinate address, and I'm going to go ahead and pass in the position. So at the end of the day, I'm going to go ahead and print our address. Alright guys, so we've come a long way. Now for us to verify that everything works, let's go ahead and test our app. So what we expect to happen is that as soon as our project launches, the geolocator will retrieve the current position, and we're going to use the location coordinates to fetch the address. And at the end of the day, we're going to print our address to our console. Okay, so our app is starting. So as you can see, we're able to navigate to our current position. As you can see, East-West Road here. Inside the console, East-West Road was also printed. So congratulations guys, we've been able to successfully implement Google Geocoding API. So this will be all for now, so see you in the next class.